What does it look like when a life is truly changed?
I feel a sense of accomplishment because I built a house. This house has brought us financial independence.
Ja, así está.
It's a great place to raise a family.
When I look back where we've come from to where we are today, it makes my heart very happy.
This house means all of us together.
Sorry.
Every family dreams to have their own house. This house changed our lives.
Habitat for Humanity is at work in your community and around the world. Through shelter, we empower.
Welcome, everyone. It's inspiring to see so many supporters join us today. Good afternoon to you all. I'm honored to be here as your moderator for Habitat for Humanity, Seattle-King County's first virtual event in its speaker series. I'm Trace Leong, morning news anchor for Cairo 7. Habitat for Humanity is a global organization that advocates with governments around the world in support of housing affordability and access for all to safe, decent, and affordable housing. With the outbreak of COVID-19, we as an entire community are seeing an impact on our region, unlike anything that we've experienced before. As every day passes, more resources are strained, creating even more barriers to those who need affordable housing. People of color are experiencing higher COVID-19 infection and mortality rates. They're disproportionately impacted by job loss, wage reductions, and business closures, all of which negatively impact access to safe and affordable housing. Without intervention, this crisis will undoubtedly worsen. How can we house more people and close racial disparities in housing? We know ownership transforms lives. It creates long-lasting and life-changing impact on families and communities, from providing a source of wealth and asset building to influencing health and educational outcomes and contributing to a sense of safety and positive community development. To discuss these important issues, including how Habitat is responding to COVID-19, its impact on housing around the world, the role of housing policies in causing our nation's racial disparities, and how housing is central to both health solutions and racial, we are joined by three important guests. Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, representing Washington's 7th Congressional District, who just won re-election this week. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you today.
Jonathan Reckford, Habitat for Humanity International CEO. We are so honored to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all.
And due to unforeseen circumstances, former HUD Deputy Secretary and former King County Executive Ron Sims can no longer join us. However, we are excited to announce that Linda Taylor, Vice President of Housing and Financial Empowerment for the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, has agreed to step in and bring her housing expertise to the conversation.
Thank you. I didn't know I was stepping in for Ron Sims. Wow.
We're very excited. Can we dive right in?
Sure.
Okay, let's begin on the importance of housing. This first question is for you, for Linda. Linda, why have you devoted so much of your career to housing? And can you explain what the state of affordable housing in Seattle is right now?
Well, the state of affordable housing in Seattle is bleak, but we're finding ways. With the help of Habitat, with the help of Homesite, with the help of all sorts of other people that provide down payment assistance and alternatives to ways to get to home ownership. And I believe I've done so much of my life doing it because I know how important it is. I know how important it is to a family to have that first home. I know how important it is to those children to live in that first home, to paint their rooms their own colors, to claim their own rooms, and to be able to vote and to really have their vote mean something because it's their community. I'm just real passionate about it. And another thing that really keeps me motivated and going is when I walk around Stewart Park and I see those people that say, "Hey, Miss Taylor, thank you. I'm still in the house." You know, those are the kinds of things that keep you going.
Linda, thank you. Our question is for Jonathan. Jonathan, I understand you've talked about housing affordability as being an invisible issue. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes, and when I talk about that, and it's beginning to change, which unfortunately, because the housing situation is so bad in so many cities, both in the US and around the world. But I talk about it because for many people, they might see people experiencing homelessness, which is, of course, totally unacceptable, but not understand that's only the tip of the iceberg of all the people struggling with housing. Whether that is affordability issues, where we have 18 million people spending over half their incomes on housing in this country, whether it is having to drive 1 or 2 hours to find housing that's affordable, which is bad for both the family and the environment, or people living in terribly overcrowded or unsafe conditions because they're having to make compromises. And my observation will be that so often when you look at the decision makers in a city and a country, it's very rare that someone who grew up in substandard or poverty housing are a member of Congress or a member of the leadership of a city or a leadership in the business class, and that becomes self-fulfilling. So they don't understand at a visceral level how critical housing is. And we would never say that housing is the only need, but in many ways it's a prerequisite. What we know is that if a child grows up in good quality housing that's stable, she stays healthier, does better in school, and then can lift herself up into all that God intends for her life. You pull housing out of that equation, and the opposite's true. We see people mired and struggling and doing worse on all of those fronts. So what we are trying to do is make housing more visible. And in some ways, what I've observed is it took it becoming such a crisis, and Seattle is a great example of this, where even middle-class families' children couldn't afford housing, and then people started paying attention to it at another level. But we already had a crisis. It's just gotten worse.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you. Congresswoman Jayapal, this next question is for you. What are the top issues concerning housing that you are hearing about from your constituents?
Yeah, Tracy, thank you so much, first of all, for moderating and for everything you do in your day job. Jonathan, thank you for the work that Habitat does. I've had the fortune to work on some Habitat houses myself as a volunteer. And, you know, now I represent a district that, frankly, we are seeing two major issues coming together, some of which have been touched on. One is just inequality, massive economic inequality. And if you look at that issue, that is something that has existed over some decades, but it is now at the worst point. I mean, we have the worst economic inequality in the United States of America since the Great Depression, added, of course, to by COVID. Even before COVID hit, we had 40% of Americans who didn't even have $400 in their bank account for an emergency. And if you're dealing with housing, you know that there are many things that are coming up all the time, and that this is a real crisis, particularly interestingly in a city like Seattle, where we have tremendous wealth, but we also have tremendous poverty. We have, you know, remarkable numbers of people experiencing homelessness that simply should not be there. And a lot of that is tied, of course, to affordability. And that's the second issue. And these are deeply intertwined. But when you look at affordability and you look at just the Seattle area, and what my constituents tell me is that we are fortunate to have a lot of big companies here that bring in people often from outside of the region to top management positions. Those are good jobs, they're good paying jobs. They also drive up the cost of housing dramatically. And so if you don't have a sufficient supply of affordable housing, what happens is those prices, whether it's rental prices or whether it's purchasing prices, those go up substantially to meet the market that is there by the top income individuals. And then you see exactly what was being described earlier, where people have to move. I used to represent the 37th legislative district in the state Senate, most diverse district, a lot of folks of color, a lot of people who are experiencing or have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. And those folks are now being driven out. They're being driven out of the central area, as my friend from the Urban League well knows. They're being driven out of South Seattle. And they're going further into South King County. And so the answer to that is that we have to build more affordable housing, and there's got to be more of an investment of it from Congress, from the federal government, all the way down to local governments. And just to this question that Jonathan raised about housing as the fundamental piece, I have introduced a bill called the Housing as a Human Right Act, because I really do believe that if you don't have housing, whatever your situation is, it makes almost everything else impossible. And we are in a crisis that existed prior to this moment. It has been a crisis that's been building, and I'm really excited that I'm in Congress. I'm the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, which has about 40% of Democrats. And let me tell you, we have a lot of people who believe that this is a number one issue that we have to address in the country.
All right. Okay. We'd now like to turn and talk about the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. Jonathan, let's start with you. Can you tell us how COVID-19, how the pandemic has impacted housing and how housing will be critical on the road to recovery?
Well, sadly, COVID took what was already a huge challenge in our cities and all across the world and made it far worse. And it's hit in an unequal way in terms of the impact. I do think on the positive side, it has made people more aware, as so many of us are working from home now, sheltering in place. We found more receptivity to people thinking about, gosh, what would it be like if I didn't have a decent place in which to shelter? But it is, I serve on the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank board, and they describe what we are experiencing as the less than. If you think about the mathematical less than sign, we have a less than economy, because for those of us who are knowledge workers, have good internet connections and safe places to live, it's actually been inconvenient, but not that difficult. For the other half of the economy, for service workers who don't necessarily have safe places to live, but who can't do their work from home, this has been a catastrophe. And so we've seen unequal and disparate impact, and particularly on people of color and low-income families have been disproportionately hurt by this. So it has taken a challenge, and we've had huge number of people who've lost their jobs, which creates insecurity. And so we have a cliff coming at us of potential evictions and foreclosures. And there have been temporary measures to forestall that, but no real solutions. So without aid to support these families, both the families who are at risk of eviction and small landlords who have to pay their mortgages are at great risk right now of a much more dramatic housing crisis. It is, we believe that not just from a moral perspective, but from a very practical perspective, housing can be an important part of the solution. Obviously, having healthy housing is really important to begin with. And what we know is that has a huge impact and actually cost savings if we can put people in healthy housing and not spend so much on health care. But we also see that there's a huge economic multiplier. So as we think about, from a governmental perspective, the next stimulus, we tend to talk about housing as infrastructure. There's an opportunity to invest, as the Congresswoman talked about, in improving the housing conditions, which will in fact create a huge number of jobs and have very positive ripples in the community. We just released a study with 2 universities that was a global study of low and moderate income countries. And they found that people significantly underestimated the economic impact of housing in the industry. And in fact, in low and moderate income, residential housing represents about 16% of GDP. So it's a huge piece of the economy and often overlooked when we think about how we rebuild economies.
Yeah, and that leads us right towards our next question for Congresswoman Jayapal. You know, additional funding for COVID relief, it's been a difficult issue for lawmakers. We've seen it. You know, what more does Congress need to do to help those who are in fear of losing their homes because they've lost their income due to the pandemic?
Well, my heart goes out to everybody who's been affected. I mean, a stunning number of lives lost, a stunning number of, over 9 million people who have been infected with the virus, and yet a response from the federal government, from the administration, that is still denying that it even exists. And so I'm hopeful that we are moving into a new time of leadership on this virus. But the very first thing we have to do is we've got to get a new eviction moratorium signed into law. We passed it in the House. The Senate needs to act so that no one else loses their housing during the pandemic. There was an initial eviction moratorium that was passed in the CARES Act legislation that we passed early on in the pandemic. It was back in the spring. And then we passed in the House earlier in the summer an extension of that moratorium through March of 2021. And I think that approach makes the most sense. But we also have to get significant assistance to people, because a moratorium is going to expire, we need to make sure that we are getting assistance directly to people, and we have to make sure that that includes the small landlords that were mentioned. And so, there are lots of different approaches to this. I had a bill called the Paycheck Recovery Act, which would have actually included small landlords as people who they would essentially be small businesses, and they would be able to claim money directly from the federal government. There's also the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act that I have sponsored, which ensures that all payments on rental homes and home mortgages are canceled or frozen. It would be retroactive to April, and it would set up an emergency fund for landlords and mortgage holders to cover those losses so that they can pay their bills. So it's good for renters, but it's also good for those small landlords, and no one is left out at a time when we just have to be bringing everyone in. I think it's important also just to say that in the context of a health pandemic, it is not only the right thing to do to make sure people can stay in their housing and to get people more housing, it is also the safe thing to do for a pandemic. We need to have people have shelter, and we need to, in order to really crush the virus, we need to have people be able to quarantine. We need to be able to have people separate themselves from others who may have the virus, and they need safe places to go. And that's on top of all the other reasons why we know that homelessness is not only morally unacceptable when we have so much wealth in this country, but it is also the safe and right thing to do in the context of a pandemic. So I am hopeful that we will get a relief package, if not immediately. I wish and I hope it can happen immediately, and I'm working to try to get it immediately. But if the Republicans continue to block it in the Senate, then I hope that with a new president, we then can pass something that meets the scale of the crisis that is just growing, with 1 million people every week filing new unemployment claims. So just imagine what that does for housing and being able to pay your rent or your mortgage.
That's Congresswoman, you're absolutely right. We see those numbers going up. We see the case count going up, which is important, especially with housing and having a place to be socially distant and to be safe, which leads us to our next question. Linda, how are the renters and the homeowners in Seattle, how do we know that they're coping with the health and economic impact of the pandemic? And how can we, as a community, better support them?
We're working on ways to better support them. We're working with United Way, and we're paying rents. But of course, there's all sorts of, but we are paying rents. And just as Congressman Gerald Paul said, it's those small landlords. There's a mortgage moratorium where you can call in and get a forbearance. But there's ifs, ands, and buts to that also, because we have people calling in, getting a forbearance, getting a job. Now you're off forbearance immediately, and you still can't catch up. And then there's all kinds of myths out there about it, that there's going to be a balloon payment in the end, and all of these things when you just can get apply for a mortgage modification, which we're helping people do. But we're rapidly trying to, we have a group of 10, I think it's about 7 women, I think they have a man on their team, and they're paying rents with United Way, and Pierce County has something, and King County has something going on. So we're really, really working hard trying to get to it, but we know we can't get to everyone. Everyone doesn't qualify, but that doesn't mean everyone isn't worthy. Because they are. There are so many people that need it. You get a job today, you can't pay your mortgage tomorrow. So because you have so much to catch up with. So we know it's an uphill battle. We're fighting. We're counting on you, Congresswoman, and others to help us fight this battle, because it's real.
Yes, absolutely, Linda. And, Jonathan, this leads us to you. How has the pandemic affected Habitat, and how are you responding on a local scale?
Unprecedented doesn't really do justice to what COVID has done. Habitat for Humanity has responded to natural and man-made disasters all over the world. But traditionally, when you have a disaster, it impacts one region, one country, and the rest of the world can come around and help with the recovery. We've never experienced something where the whole world was impacted simultaneously. it's had certainly a significant impact on us. The most is, even though it's a small amount of our total work, our volunteer-driven construction was impacted the fastest. Obviously, health and safety come first, so we stopped all of our international volunteer programs, and then our domestic volunteering. Our Habitat for Humanity restores, our home product recycling stores, all shut down for a couple of months. Those are now all back open again with good safety protocols, and that's better. And of course, we are one of the friendliest lenders out there, but we're a large mortgage lender, and we've extended forbearance. But then we actually are in the same position of so many others, which is eventually we've got to then if nobody pays those loans back, that's money that comes out of our ability then to reinvest in housing for other families. So we are concerned about that as well. We've had to certainly shift and be creative. Globally, we shifted heavily into bigger emphasis on water, sanitation, and hygiene, which is a core part of housing. But we recognize that we want to do everything we could to help the community be healthy. So hand washing stations, increasing access to fresh water, increasing sanitation, and incremental improvements in housing that made them healthier for families as they were shut in became really important. We've also upped our advocacy work, and the Congresswoman's given some great examples. We think we need advocacy at the local level, the state level, and the federal level in all of the countries that we serve in, because zoning and land use is still a local issue, and that's such a big piece of it. Seattle's got some really interesting examples of how they're trying to find ways to increase density and make it easier to build, but we need a huge amount of financing, and that's going to come at the state and federal level in order to make a meaningful difference. We're also trying to, outside the U.S., really continue our work to make markets work better for low-income families so they can improve their own shelter. And we've made a big investment and become a global leader in housing microfinance and getting the microfinance industry to make small home improvement loans to very low-income families. And that started to really scale, and happily that has largely been able to continue. And we have a shelter venture lab where we're investing alongside entrepreneurs around the world who are coming up with better building products, again, to make it easier for families to improve their own work. And lastly, continuing to work on property rights, because if women and marginalized groups around the world don't have the ability to own their property, even if they've lived there for a very long time, that restricts their ability to upgrade their housing or improve it or access financing. So we are pushing and trying to adapt, but there's no question this has made it much more difficult. And it turns out construction is a relatively safe activity to do outdoors if it's done safely. So we have begun in careful and appropriate ways to bring volunteers back, but we've continued work all the way along with contractors and professional staff to keep our building work going. But we certainly are very eager to be on the other side of this pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I think many of us are definitely eager to be on the other side of it. You mentioned, I'd like to now shift to the discussion on—
I have something to add to Jonathan's, if I may. Locally in Pierce County, we're working with Habitat, and we're providing mortgage assistance. So they're doing it. It's a small bit, but we're doing it.
But every bit counts, Linda.
Everything counts. Everything counts. Well, so there are new partners working.
Absolutely.
And just very quickly, also, you know, when I was in the state legislature, I was just in the state Senate for 2 years before coming to Congress. One of the things I worked with then Speaker Frank Chop on was transferring properties that belong to Sound Transit and other, you know, they were used as staging properties, but actually making it possible for local jurisdictions to have access to those properties and own those properties for the purpose of affordable housing, which accomplished not only creating more affordable housing, but also putting it, you know, transit-oriented development became really important because we want people to have access to transit, because a lot of the folks that, you know, need affordable housing also are ones who are using transit. So I think that there are a lot of good federal, state, local partnerships, and then some things that each jurisdiction can really take on their own.
No, certainly, thank you. Thank you, Congresswoman. I want to switch the topic discussion to racial injustice and talk about the need for government to prioritize housing, including addressing past racial discrimination in housing, in the recovery, and beyond as we move forward. Now, the homeownership rates for Black and Hispanic Latinx households continues to trail that of white households. Linda, I'd like to start with you. Can you tell us, how have housing policies in the Seattle area played a role in systemic racism?
Well, I don't think they're just in the Seattle area. I think they're all over it because it's been going on for a long time. I hate to take it back to the wars, but I have to, and I have to take it back to redlining. I have to take it back when African Americans and other people of color couldn't buy in certain neighborhoods. And I'd like to bring it up to right now, where they're just now discovering things that we've already known, that they devalue African American homes in appraisals. We're not getting the same values. I guess they've done a couple of tests, which I don't know why they needed to test what we've already known, where the wife was home, she was African American, and they got one appraisal and called out for another, got another appraisal, and the husband was white, and it got a considerably higher appraisal on the property. I mean, much higher, or over $100,000. So those things exist. That's building our generational wealth, where we can sell our homes, have our children go to school, or get a second mortgage on our home, where our children can go to school and get that education through generations. And so systemic racism plays a huge part in this, huge part, because it's been going on for quite a long time. There was a point in time in my lifetime, and I'm of age, that African Americans used other people, co-workers, to buy homes for them, right in Skyway, if you're familiar with Seattle, and then bought the home from them on a contract when we were still able to buy homes on contracts. So for a trusted individual that they bought a home from. So things like this have been going on for quite a while. African Americans were not able to even join the multiple to sell homes. In my lifetime, I've had a real estate license, and the Board of Realtors said in their bylaws, they wanted like-kind people to have to belong to the Board of Realtors. So there's just, systemic racism is real. And it goes on and on and on, and you can dig into everything, but a lot of it goes back to what's called redlining.
This region of the country, we've been in the headlines quite frequently concerning demonstrations of racial inequality. What would you say to the demonstrators, Linda, who are passionate about racial justice, police response, and then the other side, the citizens who are concerned about the violence and destruction that we are seeing play out in Seattle?
Well, I respect your passion. I must respect your passion for doing things. John Lewis's statement, good trouble, that if that's what they're doing, but the destruction helps no one when you're destroying other people's property. But I definitely respect their passion for whatever they need to do. But that's not getting you anywhere by destroying property. If you believe that's getting the attention, I really don't believe it is. So stop it, is kind of what I have to say to people that are destroying.
Thank you, Linda. And Jonathan, why do you think that Habitat is uniquely positioned to respond to issues of racial injustice?
We think everyone needs to respond, but in many ways, it comes right to the roots of Habitat for Humanity. We were actually born out of an interracial farm that was started in 1942 in Southwest Georgia, and you can imagine how popular that was. And from the very early days, then tested out in an area, in no man's land between warring tribes in what was then Zaire, now Congo. And the center of Habitat's mission statements is actually about bringing people together. And I think more than ever, we've got to find ways to bring communities together to actually do something. Housing was, as Linda shared, is probably the starkest example of systemic racism in our country, where it was structured and mandated by the federal government that we segregated housing, and there are longstanding impacts of that. So housing then should be part of the solution. And I have had the challenge, but also joy of building with Blacks and whites in South Africa, with Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, with Christians and Muslims in Egypt, with Hindus and Muslims in India, I have even built with Democrats and Republicans in the United States. So there is hope for building these bridges. And we're only going to get there if we can figure out how to bring communities together, both to have the conversation, but also to build. And what we find, a distinctive aspect of Habitat is the chance to bring people together over what may be the toughest divide in our society, which is the socioeconomic. More and more, we've got people who are comfortable mixing across race and religion, but don't have meaningful relationships with people outside their own socioeconomic class. And I think there is something, and we are trying to work on a national beloved community initiative where all over the country, we want to bring people together across races, both to build and actually physically construct, as well as to have conversations and learn and be educated about the critical role of housing and how it can be a piece of closing some of the gaps, that we have this huge homeownership gap. And we still believe that affordable homeownership isn't for everyone, but it's one of the most tried and true ways in our country for a family to build an asset over time that can be an intergenerational asset. And there are huge benefits both to the family and the community from the opportunity to own a home. One of my heroes, Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, sponsored a bill every year there. And he said something in one of the bills I loved. He said, as the physical walls of the house go up, the invisible walls that separate us as people come tumbling down, and hope is built in the community. And my hope is that Habitat can be a vehicle for reconciliation and learning and growth, and in that do something tangible about actually making the problem better. So we have seen some really lovely examples of that, but we need so much more, and we hope to be a small piece of the solution.
Thank you, Jonathan. Congressman Jayapal, talking about certain policies, we know that you have been very passionate about a lot of these policies that pertain to this topic. Well, what must be changed to ensure that more families have access to housing in communities that are, basically inviting for all?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I just want to thank my sister, Linda Taylor, for just putting institutionalized racism on the table. I just think that is a really critical piece here. And it isn't just in the housing arena. It is true in the education arena. We have a school to prison pipeline that has been here for a long time. It is within the criminal justice system more broadly. It is actually within the way in which we tackle climate change and where the burdens of climate change fall. And so really across the board, we are a country that has never dealt with our legacy of institutionalized racism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and the ways in which institutions were created specifically to keep Black folks out. And I just don't think that we can address many of these issues unless we start addressing that. And that's why in Congress, I am a proud co-sponsor of bills that address and set up a truth commission, similar to what happened in South Africa, sponsored by my friend Barbara Lee from California, a reparations commission sponsored by my friend Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas. These are critical pieces that we're going to have to address. And I say this as, I'm one of only 14 naturalized citizens to serve in the United States Congress. I'm a proud immigrant who came here at 16 years old with nothing in my pockets from India and now get to serve in the United States Congress. I'm one of only 79 out of 11,000 plus people that have ever served in Congress in the course of our history. I'm one of 79 women of color. And I do think, going back to a point that was made at the very beginning, that it matters who serves. It really does, because we have lived experiences where we prioritize things differently and we tell different stories and we make different legislation. So just, in terms of how we deal with this, we know that homelessness mostly affects people of color and that Black households account for an astounding 50% of people who are experiencing homelessness, even though they're only 13% of the population. So I'm looking at policies that add more funding and grant programs for affordable housing, that add accountability for people who profit from displacement, because this is a big part of this. There is a real profit motive built into what happens around displacement. I want to make sure we invest in wraparound services and that we overall take a housing first approach, because we've got to take care of other basic needs of people who experience housing instability, even as we work to prevent homelessness and housing insecurity. And so we've got a duty now, particularly in this time of crisis, to just step up and provide support for those who have lost their jobs and their income. Not only unemployment assistance, another round of stimulus checks, investing in childcare. And as you said at the beginning, we haven't been successful in getting some of that across the line, but we've got to make sure that we continue to support workers to get their basic needs met. Not only my Paycheck Recovery Act that would provide paychecks to people, guarantee paychecks, even if you're not going into work, that you would be able to get your paycheck directly from the federal government to the business. That's actually the approach that most European countries have taken, and many countries in Asia. But also, you know, things like, I worked across the aisle this fall to introduce a bill that increases access to free meals for young adults who are living in emergency shelters, just by increasing the age of eligibility. And so I think there's a whole panoply of things that we are going to have to invest in, because frankly, we waited so long, where people were already in crisis before COVID even hit. And we are living with a legacy of institutions that do not respond to the needs of the most vulnerable.
Congressman, thank you. We did get a question from the chat, and we are encouraging people to continue to bring those questions in. We do want to hear from you. So I do have a question for the panel. Any of you can jump in and answer this. They want to know, what do you say to people who are opposed to affordable housing in their backyard, to having it developed here?
Well, I have seen some of those same people need the affordable housing while they were opposed to it, or their children need it. I don't think there's as many people opposed to it as you believe there are. I just don't, because they all have children, relatives, somebody that needs the affordable housing. And check yourself, you might qualify. You know?
Yeah, I agree with Linda. And I would add, though, it is human nature, and we see this everywhere in the world.
Yes, it is.
Not in my backyard. NIMBY really does exist. California has gone even further. They have banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So they make it really difficult to build. We've been trying to shift to yes in my backyard, you know, to help break the myths. And some of the myths are really insidious. One is that if affordable housing is built, that's going to hurt everyone's property values. It's not true, but that perception is a huge barrier and a reason people fight so hard, because their house is often their largest asset and they want to protect the asset. And so I think we have to educate people, and it's a way the software of Habitat, which is we have to make it personal. It's not those people. These are people of the same hopes and dreams and just want to be able to provide for their families. And so if we can break down the myths and invite people in, I think COVID gets in the way of that, because we can't physically get to get people together. But I think if we can show, and then also reinforce the other side of the data. Earlier, both the Congresswoman and Linda talked about inequality. And we know the data is so clear that you can't pretend, if you just push it out of your mind, that solves everything. Everybody loses if we don't deal with it. We know that low-income children who grow up in mixed-income communities have relatively decent social mobility in our country. But low-income children growing up in concentrated poverty have almost zero social mobility. And so we know that mixed-income, mixed-use communities are the best for everyone from an economic perspective. But it's going to take education and relationship to get people over that change.
Well, I would just add, I agree with everything that was just said. And I have a personal experience with this around, you know, when I was living in Columbia City, in Hillman City, actually, in South Seattle, and DESC, Downtown Emergency Services, was going to bring in a supported housing facility for people experiencing homelessness. And so that's a lot of folks who have mental health issues, addiction issues, others. And what we found is that permanent supportive housing is the best way to take care of people who are in those situations. And it was literally like maybe 3 blocks from my house. You go down the hill and this facility was going to be right there. And all of a sudden, my neighborhood, my community that I had been a part of for decades, suddenly rose up, and there were 2 sides to this. And all of a sudden people were saying, well, I don't want, I don't want these people in my neighborhood, and it's going to hurt the neighborhood. And I was shocked. And it was actually a lot of people who had just moved into the neighborhood. Relatively.
That's what it usually is.
It usually is when it's gentrified, and suddenly saying we don't want these folks there. And so I started organizing out of my living room, actually. This is well before I was in politics, but I was still an organizer and an activist. And, we got people together and we fought back on that. And it was tough. It was contentious. But I got to tell you that what the then CEO of DESC said to me is, he said, Pramila, trust me, as soon as the thing is built, everyone will love it. And sure enough, that's what happened. There was a community room that everyone had access to. It was built on a corner that had been pretty much abandoned and frankly wasn't that great to walk by before. There was all the myths of who, quote, these people are were they're like your brother, your sister, your grandmother. They're people who are struggling. And we as a community can put we first instead of me first. And I think that's the thing we just have to remember in the United States of America is that, we first gets all of us forward. We're all better off when we're all better off. Me first means you might be better off, but everybody else is worse off. And that means our society and therefore your future, even if you think about it self-interestedly, can't get better.
When I have colleagues in town from other urban leagues across the country, I take them on a little tour, of course. They cannot believe our low-income housing looks so good. They can't believe our public housing looks so good. And it's right next to our Habitat homes. They just can't believe it. So we do a wonderful job of blending into our community. And we still have to fight, though. There's a lot of things we still have to fight for. We had a local nonprofit that didn't want people with criminal records purchasing homes. And that was the only thing they could do because they couldn't rent. We sat down, had a conversation, and, made them know that these people have jobs. Some of these people had careers. They just had a criminal record. And they lifted that off of their policies. So once you bring things to people's attention and show them why, when, and where, we do a good job in the Pacific Northwest, actually. We do a wonderful job.
There's a time for a quick story. One of my all-time favorite stories comes from my friend Tony Campolo, and real story came from Norris, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia. And very much like the Congressman's example, they wanted to create some supportive housing. And the town just poured out. 500 people showed up at the town council, all demanding that this not happen. They didn't want those people in their neighborhoods. And town council voted unanimously actually to reject the proposal. And just as after they made the vote, TV's there, media's there, the doors open and Mother Teresa walks in, and she walks down to the front and literally gets down on her knees and says, please, I beg of you, in the name of Jesus, don't treat your brothers and sisters this way. And there's just total silence, and the cameras are going and people are watching, and there's just nothing happens for a minute. And then one of the council members puts his hand up, says, move we revisit the motion. They revote, 100% unanimous agreement to accept, and there was not a complaint from anybody in the room. Now, it just happened, Mother Teresa was in town for a Sisters of Mercy. Someone told her about this and she said, I have to go. And she changed her plans and showed up. But she had moral authority. And what we need is people of goodwill to use their moral authority to be allies and to come in and speak up, because it is possible to make these changes, but it's not easy. And I think there's a natural resistance to any change, and we need to help people understand the positive sides of change.
I totally agree. Once people understand, they change up.
And thank you, just, such passionate stories and personal experiences, which is such a strong panel. So thank you again for diving into this. We do have another question from the chat that I would like to direct to all three of you as well. We want to know, do HOAs need to be looked at in their contribution to gentrification and lack of housing diversity? And are there zoning laws that need to be more holistic?
I'll jump in and welcome other additions. I think my view is the answer is yes. That zoning, Linda talked about this, but the first step was after World War II, the federal government mandated when a lot of the new affordable housing that it be segregated. That led to the redlining that she talked about. But the other thing that happened is that neighborhoods were built all over the country that specifically were restricted by race and religion. Right. And those laws held up until the Civil Rights Act, or Fair Housing Act in the late 60s, and still are on the books in many communities. So one way to get density, when people hear affordable housing, they think giant, post-war federal building high-rises. But the reality is several cities around the country have found ways to increase density in smaller ways, whether that's accessory dwelling units, and Seattle has looked hard at that, whether that is increasing broad density. In Minneapolis, and it's only controversial, but they looked at 80% of all the land being zoned single family, and they did a citywide zoning change that would allow 2 or 3 or 4 units to be built on any lot. And that's a way of increasing access to the communities of opportunity that doesn't dramatically change character of neighborhoods or make huge. So I do think zoning is going to have to be a piece of it, because land use is such a reason right now that it's hard to get projects done.
And I think from the federal government, really, because a lot of the zoning laws are local, but what the federal government can do is we can make our monies as flexible as possible, and we can put in incentives into the federal funding to some extent. Obviously, it gets passed down through many different levels, but we can find ways to incentivize certain kinds of developments and prioritization for the most vulnerable communities. And so that, I think, if that's what's meant by inclusive, I think that's a role that the federal government can play. But a lot of the zoning issues are obviously local, and that's why it's so important that folks at the local level are deeply engaged, because zoning it's a complicated issue. It can be used for good and for bad. And I think it is really, and it varies from place to place. So it's not something that necessarily is consistent across places, but I think it's a very important area for activism from local communities who really want to see a we first society and want to bring more people into housing.
I totally agree.
All right, thank you so much. And we do also want to, Congressman Jayapal, you mentioned earlier, and we know in March, you helped introduce the Housing is a Human Right Act. Can you explain how this addresses homelessness and the housing crisis that we're seeing?
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity, because we worked really hard on this bill and we're super excited about it, because it is really putting forth a different vision of how we think about housing. And it's addressing decades of chronic underinvestment and lack of funding for housing, and prioritizing a holistic view. And so just a little bit about what it would do. It would help community organizations, so really engaging the community in addressing homelessness by investing more than $200 billion in federal grant programs that fund critical affordable housing infrastructure and support services. It would also boost, we have a lot of existing federal grant programs, but it would boost those grant programs, and it would establish some new ones, like a block grant program that specifically helps communities develop infrastructure that responds to all of the different needs of people experiencing homelessness or housing instability. That's the range of support services that we know people need. And then, this is to the point at the very beginning, it makes sure that people with lived experience of homelessness or housing instability have a seat at the table where policy decisions are being made. I'm an organizer, and I believe that no good policy happens without having that lived experience and that voice at the table. It protects tenant rights, and it also expands the development of affordable housing. And then it does crack down on developers who profit from displacement. This is a big issue in the housing arena, and we just have to take steps to really bring accountability forward and not make this a profit-making enterprise. And then finally, it helps to ensure that voters who are experiencing housing instability have their voices heard at the ballot box, because unfortunately, that is another part of why we don't always have the right policies, because the communities that would benefit from those policies are not always able to vote and participate in our democracy. And that's everything from making sure that formerly incarcerated people and even those who are in incarceration facilities right now have the ability to vote. It's also about making sure that people who are experiencing housing insecurity or homelessness are also able to vote. So it's been a fabulous project, and I've just been so excited about the incredible range of coalition organizations that we've built to support this bill, and I hope we can pass it into law.
Congresswoman, thank you. And thank you for all the work that you continue to do right now. We do have another question from the chat room, and this is directed towards Jonathan, or how are affordable housing applications prioritized, and what are some of the common blockers of being approved?
So the basic principles all over the world are the same for us. We always build with, not for, and we talk about partnership. And so the core criteria to qualify to buy a Habitat house are that you have to be too low income to get a traditional mortgage or to be able to afford a market rate house. Second, that you're willing to partner, and for us that means clean up your credit and demonstrate the ability to pay an affordable mortgage. And then third, in lieu of a cash down payment, which so many families can't do, put in what we call sweat equity, which is putting in hundreds of hours of literally helping build your home and your neighbors' homes, but also taking classes in financial management and home maintenance so that you're really well prepared when you purchase that home. So the great dilemma, of course, is the demand so outstrips the supply. And so as we look for it among all the potentially qualifying families, then we go to highest need, and we towards those who have children, who have and who have the most risk. But the great dilemma, the constraint in a place like Seattle, of course, is land. The land prices have accelerated far faster than incomes for the last decade, and long true. And so it's really a math problem we have to solve together. And this is where I think city by city, we need the mayor and the cities to be together with the nonprofit and the voices of the community, very much as the Congresswoman said, but with the builders and the bankers too. And how do you solve the math problem? Because a good-hearted builder, and Habitat's a good-hearted builder, can't make the math work without some subsidy now. The land is just too expensive. So there's some really good examples in Seattle where the city has subsidized or donated land. There are other examples with CRA or other ways of stacking subsidy into financing. But I think we've just got to challenge it, because today the market's not working. We need way more housing. And so what's it going to take to really make that happen? And that's going to take, I think, some of all of the above. And I think there's something for the other side too, which is, can we make it easier to build faster and get more units out of the ground? But it really is going to take everybody. And of course, we would love to serve far more and partner with far more families.
The Urban League has been in partnership with Habitat, doing some of that financial work, and we had a home club, and so it was about 10 women, and one of them decided to buy Habitat. So all 10 of us, well, it must be 11 because I was there too, put on hard hats, went out and took pictures, of course, and helped her build her Habitat home. And that was about 15 years ago. And we're still in touch with her. We still see her. We went to her children's graduations. And she's a great homeowner, And she took our classes because of we have Washington State Housing Finance Commission. That certificate expired on her. So she had to take it again. So she was 4 years studying until she bought her home, but she did, and we all cried together, we laughed together, we ate together, but it was the best experience. I truly believe in the product and the work that they do.
Thank you for sharing that story, Linda. And it's what's so amazing, Jonathan, Congresswoman Jayapal, Linda, you all are open that we need to work together. This is a partnership. We cannot do this alone, and we get more done when we see more organizations, more groups, more people come together on this. I feel like we could continue talking about this for hours. I appreciate how passionate you are, but we are coming close to 1 o'clock. So I would like to take the time to close, but I want to ask each of you a final question. Could each of you identify the single most important point you would make about housing for the coming year?
Well, I'm happy to go first, and just to first say thank you so much to Linda and Urban League and Jonathan and Habitat and you, Tracy, for this really important panel. And for me, it's just this. We got to keep people in their homes with a roof over their head during this pandemic. We cannot allow millions of people to be evicted. We know it was already a problem. And so we've just got to step up and take this crisis seriously and really make sure that we don't send more people into homelessness and housing instability. Everything else depends on it. It's why my bill is called Housing is a Human Right, because I really believe that people need to be able to be in their homes, and particularly in the pandemic. So that is my focus as we go into hopefully a new administration, a new Congress. That is my focus. We have to remember that people need their homes. And if there's anyone out there who's wondering, why that's so important, just imagine where you would be today if you weren't sitting in your home. I'm here in my home. I've got my books, I've got my family, I got my bed. And I am so grateful every morning for what I have. And I want to make sure that everybody else gets to have that same thing.
I like to tell people to get yourself educated. Educate yourself to the process of homeownership, because it is a process. Don't go with the first thing you hear or see or what your neighbor told you, especially if they didn't take a class. But get yourself educated, get yourself prepared, because that opportunity will come. This is your way to build your generational wealth. This is your way to help your children. This is your way to help their children, and they will continue. I have a daughter, she would not dream of not being a homeowner. Her daughter, my granddaughter, is early 20s. She's ready. She's ready, just waiting for the opportunity, living with me, saving her money. But anyway, they are just waiting for the opportunity. But she's ready. She could have this conversation with you now, because she has been educated. I think educating yourself, getting your credit together, keeping it together is one of the most important things that I can leave you with today.
That's great. If I can just add first, thank you as well. Congresswoman, thank you so much for your leadership. Linda, thank you for your leadership in Seattle. And Tracy, thank you so much for facilitating us today. I would just close with that this is hard and complicated. Housing isn't easy. But if you care about health, you have to care about housing. If you care about racial equity and justice, you have to care about housing. And if you care about rebuilding our economy, we have to care about housing. So I would just encourage all of you, find a way to get involved, to get engaged, and so that we can move towards a world where everyone has a safe, decent, and affordable place to live.
Absolutely. As we conclude our virtual experience today, we of course want to thank our panelists, our wonderful panelists, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, Jonathan Reckford, and Linda Taylor. Cannot thank you enough. I mean, clearly we could probably continue this dialogue, and I hope people continue reaching out to you, and you can continue, the conversation, and of course, the great leadership that we've seen from all three of you. So thank you. And
thank you. This was great.
And we, of course, want to thank everyone else who joined us here today and for supporting Habitat for Humanity. We want to keep the momentum going. So join us again for an upcoming speaker series events. Of course, we will be letting you know and keeping in touch about that. And tell others, please, about Habitat, a wonderful organization. Donate to or shop at Habitat store. And consider getting more involved as a Habitat volunteer. There are plenty of opportunities, even during this pandemic, right, Jonathan?
Absolutely.
And we also want you to advocate for legislation that supports affordable housing and racial equity. Remember, you're investing in your community when you engage with Habitat, and you can learn more about how to get involved at habitatskc.org and to find out more about Habitat's global work go to habitat.org. So in closing, we did get amazing people, and we want to thank all the amazing people that make Habitat happen. Thank you to everyone and all your contributions, and we hope everyone has a great day. Of course, this series panel today has been recorded, so we will make that link available after we conclude. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.